Thank you all for being here today, and I will be presenting on my dissertation, which again is titled The Tale of Two Cities, a qualitative investigation of the lived experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims in Boston and Detroit. So to just start us off, I just wanted to honor some of my family members that have gone on before me and who I dedicate this work to, and chiefly at the top, my Aunt Roberta Martin, who my entire dissertation is dedicated to, as she was tragically taken from our family a few years ago. And I hope that the work that I am doing will honor her life and honor the lives of all of the victims and participants that I'll be discussing today. So just to give you an agenda for what I'll be talking about, I'm going to start with talking about my research context, then go into the methods that were used for this dissertation. I'll be sharing, in the interest of time, only able to share a little bit of my results and discussion, a few limitations, implications, and end with some acknowledgments, and then of course we'll move into the questions. So we are currently experiencing a homicide epidemic in the United States. As the CDC reported, between 2019 and 2020, we saw the largest one-year increase in homicide rates. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but historically, homicide rates disproportionately affect Black individuals. As you can see, the rate for Black individuals is 22.6 per 100,000 persons versus the national rate of 5.9 per 100,000 persons, which is significantly higher than any other racial and ethnic group. And when one Black person is killed, there are several friends and family members that get left behind to deal with the aftermath of that killing. And while we have significant data about homicide rates, we know much less about the experiences of these loved ones of the victims. And this includes things such as what coping strategies they utilize to deal with the murder, whether there are adequate support specifically for Black survivors, and how their geographical context, meaning where they live, has an impact on their experience after having a loved one killed. And this is important because historically, studies that looked at coping with traumas, such as the homicide of a loved one, left out Black individuals as part of their sample. So for my dissertation, I developed an integrated conceptual model to guide my research. Due to the complexity of the Black survivor of homicide victim experience, one theory was not enough to capture the basis for this research. I used circles to represent how each layer is embedded within each other and has an effect on the yellow circle, which are the survivors themselves. This integrated theoretical model for Black survivors of homicide victims includes several components that I will briefly describe. And all of these components interact with one another to shape the way that Black survivors navigate their lives. So Tanya Sharp's model of coping in the blue circle offers a foundational comprehensive understanding of the major coping mechanisms that are employed by survivors to help them deal with the murder. It represents the cultural perspective of how Black survivors of homicide victims make meaning of the homicide, determine the homicide's impact, and ascertain available resources to cope with the murder. It can be used as a basis for understanding the toll that homicide takes on Black survivors within their immediate context. While the coping model can help deepen the understanding of interpersonal factors that shape Black survivors' experiences, the impact that neighborhood context has on survivors should also be considered. The neighborhood context for Black survivors manifests itself within the macro system level of Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which is all in the gray circle, because it is situated within the larger cultural context that these individuals exist in. Few studies have examined the specific neighborhood aspects that are important for Black survivors. Because of that, my dissertation seeks to identify potential mechanisms through which neighborhoods may shape experiences and outcomes for Black survivors of homicide victims. So this dissertation explores 3 overlapping neighborhood contexts: collective efficacy, institutional resources, and exposure to violence, and what those have, the impact that those have on Black survivors of homicide victims. The selection of these 3 mechanisms is rooted in the fact that socially organized communities with a sense of unity and institutional support can have a direct role in mediating the relationship between disadvantage and crime. Finally, in the pink circle, critical race theory situates Black survivors within a stratified society and emphasizes the roles of social position, racism, and segregation for setting Black survivors of homicide victims apart from other ethnic racial groups of survivors, with special attention to how these types of stratification occur on a societal and neighborhood level. Concentrated neighborhood composition may contribute to Black survivors of homicide victims having fewer and lower quality institutions to promote healing and offer support. But the composition also may contribute to a sense of community that can act as a buffer for survivors' overall well-being. By integrating these theoretical perspectives into a model, a deeper understanding of the Black survivor experience in urban settings can be obtained. So because of the gaps in the literature that I'm trying to fill and the lack of research in this area, the two major research questions that I explore with this dissertation is number one, how does geographical context affect the lived experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims in Boston and Detroit? And second, how does geographical context impact the coping strategies that Black survivors of homicide victims utilize? So in terms of the methods, I conducted semi-structured interviews with the participants, which were all done virtually, as the Boston University Institutional Review Board restricted research to virtual only during the time I was collecting data due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nonetheless, I was still able to conduct the interviews with no problems. All interviews range from 40 minutes to an hour and a half. An IRB approved recruitment flyer was created and distributed. It was placed in areas such as the Boston University School of Social Work social media pages, and it was sent via email to organizations in both Boston and Detroit that provide services to Black adults who have experienced trauma based on their websites or other information that I obtained. I also emailed the flyers to local Black businesses, as it was my initial intention to take physical flyers, but the pandemic halted that plan. It was also shared with my personal networks of individuals and organizations that I have previously worked with that serve this population. One organization, particularly in Detroit, that serves Black families who have had loved ones killed, referred several individuals by first asking their permission to provide me with their contact information and then doing so. Each of the participants were given a $30 gift card for their participation. They signed a document confirming receipt of the gift card along with the signed consent form. There were 27 participants that were screened, which was a separate call from the actual interview, where I gathered demographic information and told the participants about the study, confirmed their participation, and provided them with and explained the consent form. 26 interviews were completed successfully. 14 of the participants were from Detroit and 12 were from Boston. All participants identify as Black, and I use the term Black for this dissertation because I not only have African Americans in the sample, but also those representing the diaspora, such as Haitians and Cape Verdeans. This sample was split evenly in terms of men and women at 13 and 13. The average age of the participants was 33, ranging from 20 to 64 years old. And the average age of the homicide victims was 23.8, ranging between 15 to 35 years old. The chart on the right outlines the relationships of the survivors to their loved ones, and as you can see, there was a wide range, with the highest being either siblings or cousins. Also, if you notice, the number of victims is higher than the number of participants, because there were more than one of the survivors who had more than one loved one killed in the past 4 years, with a participant, Shannon from Boston, having lost the most, 4. So phenomenology is the appropriate qualitative lens to study Black survivors because it aided in uncovering the internal meaning of their lived experience after having a loved one killed. For this dissertation, I specifically used hermeneutic phenomenology, which is based on an article by Ajawi and Higgs, 2007, and is focused on providing rich textual descriptions of experiences of a specific phenomena informed by relevant theory. So in this study, the experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims were explored in depth, and interpretations of the participants' experiences were informed by the integration of the coping model, neighborhood effects, and critical race theory, which I described in my theoretical slide earlier. There were 6 stages in my data analysis. As you can see on this slide, for the interest of time, I cannot go through all 6 of them, but these are the steps that I took in analyzing this data that is again informed by the Ajawi and Higgs 2007 article. So for my results, what you will see first is a chart that outlines the 10 major themes that were developed from my data analysis. And again, in the interest of time, I can't go through all 10 themes, but I will share in more depth a few of the themes. But firstly, there were 5 themes that spoke to the first question, which was how does geographical context affect the lived experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims in Boston and Detroit. And those themes were Black Lives Don't Matter, loss of collective efficacy, gentrification, culture of violence, and geographic status. The remaining 5 themes address the second question, which is how does geographical context impact the coping strategies that Black survivors of homicide victims utilize. And those themes were no safe haven, institutional resources, culturally tailored services, accessibility, awareness, and availability, and room for improvement. The first theme that I'll go into a little bit more detail with, it speaks to the first research question, and it's called Black Lives Don't Matter. And this theme was spoken by all 26 of the participants. And it talks about how Black survivors of homicide victims, they exist and interact with structures that are inherently racist. So when they have a loved one killed, there is a double stigma because they're already stigmatized by identifying as Black. And then when their loved one's killed and they have to interact with certain entities such as the police department or the criminal justice system or support services, they grapple with their identity. And also, when a survivor talked about their loved one being killed by a white individual, it was always racially motivated. So for example, this quote is from Sharon from Boston. Her sister was killed. She was stabbed to death in the bathroom of a club by a white man who was upset at her for refusing to dance with him. And she says, "Who stabs a lady for not wanting to dance with you? It was things that I don't even want to remember. It was painful, and it is still painful because she didn't deserve what she got. Why is being Black a problem? I don't know why." So this is a sentiment that I found across all of the participants. The second theme, no safe haven, speaks to the second research question, which talks about how does geographical context impact the coping strategies. And no safe haven is a theme where the survivors discussed how where they live impacts their sense of safety following the murder of their loved one, with the majority of them feeling unsafe because all of the participants were from middle to low income families, meaning that if their loved one was murdered in their neighborhood, they have to return back to that neighborhood after the killing, whereas many of these murders are unsolved. So the killer is still walking around free and the survivors are living in these neighborhoods. And so Naomi from Detroit, her cousin was killed when he was transferring items into his car to get ready for work. It was a drive-by shooting. The murder is not solved. And she is the one in her family who was taking the lead in raising awareness on trying to find who did this to him. She has gotten billboards created. She has gone on the news and spoken about this. She flyers around in the community on the anniversary of his killing. And she lives 3 blocks from where her cousin's home was. So she talks about how she feels unsafe being the one out in the forefront trying to get justice for her cousin. She said, and it's kind of scary too at the same time, because I bring a lot of awareness. I'm the one that made the organization post. The person that did this, are they mad at me, because I'm not going to stop till we seek justice. Finally, the third theme that I'll share with you also speaks to the second research question. This one is called culturally tailored services. So this theme is important because some of the survivors in this study were talking about whether or not the support services they sought out were culturally relevant to Black individuals living in urban areas. So there were examples of when that was done well and when that was not done well. This example from Shannon from Boston, who is the participant who has had 4 loved ones killed in the past 5 years, she talked about a situation where it was done well. She says it's a Black organization, Black family members supporting other Black family members who have lost loved ones. And so I think in that aspect, they were able to relate more to us in what we were dealing with. So what she's describing is a prominent organization in Boston that knows the Black communities in Boston, who also has experienced a homicide of a loved one. They created a support organization, and now they provide support services to Black families who have had loved ones killed. So after her cousin was killed, this organization reached out to her family. They went to their house. They provided them with financial support. They provided them with long-term support. They provided them with access to support groups. And so this is an example where it was done right. Whereas another one of my participants described a situation where she sought out counseling and her therapist was a white woman. And in the first session, when she was describing why she was in therapy and describing what happened to her brother, he was shot and killed in the car. The white therapist goes on to ask her, well, was he in a gang? So there's a huge mismatch in the support services because that therapist does not understand the harm that statement could cause and how to interact with people in the Black community who are chronically exposed to violence. So now for the discussion. Again, I'll remind you of my research questions. The first one being, how does geographical context affect the lived experiences of Black survivors of homicide victims in Boston and Detroit? And how does geographical context impact the coping strategies that Black survivors of homicide victims utilize? So how has this dissertation contributed to the literature on Black survivors of homicide victims? Well, firstly, all the participants talked about how racial identity impacts every aspect of these Black survivors' lives, which is different from those who do not identify as Black. So as I was speaking to before, there's a difference because Black people are doubly stigmatized. So they already feel like they're walking around with a target on their back because they're Black. And then they have a loved one killed who is also Black. So when they try to do things such as seek justice or get support services, they come into contact with their identity because the people they're interacting with don't treat them how they should. Secondly, Black survivors often feel disconnected from their communities due to fear and a lack of trust, which makes it difficult to get justice for their loved one's murder. So many of the survivors in this study talked about how there's a lack of sense of community in the Black neighborhoods that once existed, and people are afraid to come forward and give vital information that can solve the cases. 95% of the homicides in this study are unsolved. And many of the survivors talked about how they know who killed their loved one, and so do people in the community, but they will not come forward and give the police the information they need to solve these cases. Also, many of the survivors live in neighborhoods in which they are chronically exposed to violence and lack resources, which impacts their ability to cope. There were some good examples in which survivors felt very supported, but the majority of them did not. So when they are chronically exposed to violence, meaning that a lot of them have seen more than one loved one killed, my cutoff was the past 5 years, but there were a lot of them that talked about their whole life, the past 20 years. They've seen countless family members and friends get killed, and what that has a huge impact on them. And then on top of that, they live in neighborhoods where they have less access to support resources. However, as I was saying before, when quality resources are present in their neighborhoods, it has a positive influence on their experiences following the murder and facilitates them being able to cope and heal from this tragedy. So just a few limitations quickly. One of the limitations is that only one interview was conducted with each participant due to the limitations with the pandemic. And normally in qualitative research, sometimes you want to go back and do more than one interview, but I did not have the opportunity to do that. And the second limitation that I would highlight is that this sample size of 26 is very notable for this area of study. However, it is still not representative of the entire Black survivor population in the United States, which warrants further studies to be done to completely and fully understand what the Black survivor experience is in the United States. And finally, implications. The implication for research is that this dissertation advances the research relevant to Black survivors of homicide victims because this study considers how place impacts coping and experiences, which is rarely found in the current literature. For practice, these findings can be used to foster discussions that are going to help improve relationships between Black survivors and entities such as the police and the criminal justice system that survivors have to come in contact with, so that we can better support them and give them what they need. And finally, on a policy level, as I talked about before, many of these homicides are unsolved in Black communities. There was even an article written about Boston being one of the worst cities for clearance rate. There's a backlog of 1,000 unsolved homicides, with the majority of them being Black victims dating back to the 1970s. So we need to create policies on local, state, and federal level that will, for one, pour more money into police departments so that they can hire more detectives and increase allocations towards witness protection programs so that people will feel more comfortable coming forward and sharing information. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I just have this screen with my acknowledgments. I cannot acknowledge everyone, but these are just some of the people who have been vital in me getting to this point here today. And I will not run through all of them, but I just want to highlight thanking my dissertation committee, the women who have served on my committee these past few years. Thank you for all of your support and help in getting me to this point, and especially to my academic advisor, Dr. Judith Scott, for all that she has done for me. And you all can see the other acknowledgments on the screen, but I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you for listening.